Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining WAND for our webinar this afternoon. We're very excited to hear from Michelle Barsa, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us today. My name is Udzi Vokiwa. I am a Senior Program Associate here at WAND, and I will be running the technology today. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees are going to be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions for Michelle, please submit them using the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. When you type them into that box, the questions will come to me, and I'll ask them aloud to Michelle after she finishes her presentation. If you're having any technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar support directly. They can be reached at 1-800-263-6317. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tanya Henderson, Public Policy Director here at WAND, to introduce Michelle. Tanya?
Thank you, Udzi. Good afternoon, everyone. I can't tell you how excited I am today to introduce our speaker, Ms. Michelle Barsa. She's the Senior Manager of Policy at Inclusive Security Action, a program of the Institute for Inclusive Security. And Michelle's travel schedule this month alone includes work in Turkey, Colombia, Libya, Geneva, and Afghanistan. So as you can imagine, we are very fortunate that she could take the time to join us for this important discussion and timely discussion on empowering Afghan women post-2014 and Afghan elections. So thank you so much for making this effort, Michelle. At Inclusive Security Action, Michelle focuses on expanding the roles of women in peace and security processes globally. In addition to advising on broader U.S. foreign policy related to women, peace, and security, she leads Inclusive Security's work in Afghanistan and supports Middle East programming with a focus on Syria. Prior to joining Inclusive Security, Michelle worked for Catholic Relief Services in Afghanistan and in Jerusalem's West Bank and Gaza office, as well as for the UN Peacekeeping Mission in Sudan. And she holds a master's degree in gender and conflict from my own alma mater, the Fletcher School at Tufts University. But what I appreciate most about Michelle is that her expertise is rooted in both her on-the-ground work with women globally, from South Sudan to Afghanistan, on issues of political participation and decision-making, inclusion in peace-building processes and conflict prevention, as well as her policy work in Washington, D.C. and at the UN in New York to ensure that the perspectives of women are integrated into our national and international agendas. And then lastly, most recently, in October 2013, Michelle was invited to testify before the U.S. House Armed Services Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee on the challenges to securing Afghan women's gains in post-2014 environment. And in December 13, the Daily Beast published an op-ed by Michelle on the importance of the inclusion of Afghan women in the security sector. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over our webinar to the expertise of Ms. Michelle Barsa on empowering Afghan women post-2014 in the Afghan elections.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm so glad to be here today. I'll take maybe just a minute or two to give a little bit of background on inclusive security so people know the kind of work that we've been doing in Afghanistan and who we are, and then launch from there into the discussion, our topic for today's discussion, empowering Afghan women post-2014. So Inclusive Security is an NGO based in Washington, D.C. We're just about 25 people focused exclusively on expanding the role for women in peace and security processes worldwide. We do that in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sudan, South Sudan, Israel, as well as with a general focus on U.S. foreign policy. In Afghanistan, we've been working with women leaders there for the last decade. I've been leading our work in Afghanistan for about 4 years now, traveling there about every 2 to 3 months, where we work with women on the High Peace Council, women on the provincial peace committees, women in civil society, women parliamentarians, and then most recently women in the Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police. So that's the background. That's where we're coming from. When we're in country, we're typically convening women from these various sectors. We're pushing out information about ongoing peace and security processes. We're gathering information from them about what these processes are looking like at a local and national level, and then doing training that's focused on community mobilization, and then, of course, policy level advocacy. Okay, so coming back to Afghanistan. What the international community is most focused on right now, beyond negotiations related to the bilateral security agreement, are the security transition and the political transition. So when we talk about the security transition, of course, we're talking about the transfer of responsibility for providing security from the international coalition forces to the Afghan government. That transfer is now more or less complete. And then the political transition, we're talking mostly about the elections scheduled for April 5th, 2014. We're talking about the institutional reform that needs to happen still at a national and subnational level. And then the peace negotiations, now we're thinking of mostly as part and parcel of this political transition as well. The two processes are interdependent, right? So the success of security transition is dependent upon the success of the political transition and vice versa, but still are rolled out mostly in parallel, which is part of the problem with what we're seeing happen in Afghanistan. The political transition now, we know April 5th, 2014, these are seminal elections where Afghans will take to the poll to decide not only who the next Afghan president will be, but also there'll be a series of provincial council contests, right? So you have 2,700 individuals now running for election to the provincial councils. The provincial councils bear not only primary responsibility for public administration at a local level, but they also nominate 34 delegates to serve in the upper house of parliament. Okay, so 33% of the upper house of parliament will be comprised by individuals elected in these April elections. Keep in mind, too, that the provincial councils are a major feeder mechanism for women in parliament, so often women will run for the provincial council seat before they run for a national seat in parliament. So without women on the provincial councils, that pipeline dries up. There's been an unprecedented amount of public debate around these elections, which is interesting and I think not something we necessarily hear about enough here in the U.S. Civic engagement has been at a higher level than we've ever seen, at least since the history of the intervention since 2001. There have been televised debates amongst the presidential candidates that had never happened before. It's inspired and incentivized a massive public debate where civil society activists have been scrutinizing the political platforms of candidates, not just deciding their votes and their selection along ethnic and tribal lines. This is all new. There have been massive surveys where you're seeing that 96% of Afghans think the elections are important, 86% of Afghans think elections are an Islamic act, and 79% intend to vote. Right now, leading candidates for the election are, of course, Ashraf Ghani, Abdullah, and Zalmay Rasool. Rasool has selected a female VP candidate on his ticket, which is an interesting move. The impact of these elections will be wide-reaching, that goes without saying. The newly elected president has the potential to barter away women's rights in a negotiated settlement with the Taliban, also has the potential to, of course, revoke existing legal protections for women, predominantly the Elimination of Violence Against Women law, which was enacted by presidential decree in 2009 and can just as easily be revoked by the next sitting president. On the provincial level, of course, there's a strong concern of a conservative provincial leadership leading a return to draconian judicial and social practices of the Taliban era, which is not something we want to see happen. But you can't only think about the impact of elections on women. You have to think about how women impact elections, right? And when you think about women as political actors, not just as victims, you come to identify their political influence, and that's what we use to better shape U.S. foreign policy to support women in driving positive change. When I think about women as political actors, particularly in relation to elections, I tend to think about them in the three sort of broad stroke categories of women as voters, women as candidates, and women as rights defenders. So let's go through each of those and talk a little bit about how they'll engage with these upcoming April elections, and then of course the 2015 parliamentary elections that'll follow. So women as voters have tended to vote to the left, and to the Afghan left, of course, so relatively speaking, but they tend to be more liberal voters. Arguably, they suffer most from extremist interpretations of Islam and have the most to lose from the Taliban reclaiming power, and you see them demonstrating a knowledge of that in their voting patterns. They have a vested interest in electing liberal and moderate candidates, and informed female voters tend to do so. Female voters in Afghanistan run up against a number of barriers. There's a general lack of education and awareness that's been slowly chipped away at over the years with a number of civic education interventions, but still an issue. There's a shared threat of insecurity and instability throughout most of the country that impacts, of course, male and female voters. But for women, it's a bit different because they often have to ask permission to leave their homes, and they're often denied that permission when insecurity and instability is rampant. the polling stations are not necessarily located close enough to villages and districts and often require travel long distances, which is not feasible for women, or sometimes men and their family refuse to escort them as is culturally required and necessitated, particularly in the South. There's a major issue of access. There's also a huge issue with widespread proxy voting, where men vote on behalf of their female family members. Typically, they'll cover themselves up in a burqa. Often a male poll worker will not feel comfortable asking a woman to lift up her burqa to verify that she is, in fact, the individual who's depicted on her ID. So men will cloak themselves in burqa to enter and vote on behalf of female members of their family. As candidates, so that's women as voters, right? So as candidates, you see that women as public officials tend to increase the level of citizen involvement in democratic governments. There's strong evidence that as women are elected to office, there's also a corollary increase in policymaking that reflects the priorities of families, women, and ethnic and racial minorities. Overall, it amounts to policies that reflect the needs of diverse constituencies, as well as civic engagement that forms the foundation of healthy democracies. In Afghanistan, we see a trend of increasing interest among Afghan women in running for public office. The number of female candidates from the 2010 parliamentary elections was 24% higher than the prior round in 2005, which is a positive indicator. Of course, we have to acknowledge that quotas have played a big role in that, and they continue to. The quotas that currently exist are 25% for women in the lower house, 17% for women in the upper house, and then prior it had been 25%, there was a 25% quota for women on the provincial councils, but that has since been reduced to 20%. There was an incident last May where the lower house of parliament revoked the quota altogether. Women found out about it, mobilized, applied a great deal of pressure to the head of the lower house, and then got the quota reinstated, though at the reduced level of 20%. Among the 27 candidates that were originally competing for the presidential bid, there was just one woman, and then eventually she was disqualified along with 16 others, citing a failure to meet candidacy requirements. It was unclear exactly what had gone wrong, but they claimed that there was some issue with her paperwork. Habiba Sorabi, who is currently the only female governor in Afghanistan, she is the governor of Bamiyan province, is, as I mentioned, now the VP, the only female VP who's sitting on the Rasul ticket. Women candidates in Afghanistan, they typically receive direct threats of bodily harm. They also risk social marginalization and stigmatization stemming from conservative cultural norms that limit women's roles in public life. Campaigning outside of capital cities usually requires the accompaniment of a male relative. So when families are opposed to women's political involvement, they can easily prevent it by denying that male escort. This is especially problematic, as you can imagine, for sitting female parliamentarians who are seeking re-election, as it limits their ability to return to their home provinces and explain the successes they were able to achieve to their primary constituent base, to their primary voter base. It can also limit the political race to women backed by existing male-dominated power networks, right? So it's only women who have access to male-dominated power networks who have the capacity to campaign at a provincial level, who are assured that security, and then ultimately get elected. And then finally, the category that's potentially most at risk in all this is thinking about women as rights defenders. These women are working tirelessly to conduct civic education campaigns to ensure women make informed choices at the polls, right? To ensure that they understand not only the various political platforms of the candidates, but then that they're entitled, that they have the right to vote, depending upon which political platform they prefer. And of course, the hope is that they prefer the political platform that best addresses women's rights, protections for women's rights. These rights defenders assist with registering women to vote, explaining how to vote, and then generally explaining the value of elections and how this all relates to participatory democracy, right, to a more stable state. When you're thinking about how to support women, as voters, candidates, and rights defenders, this is not really about recreating the wheel here. It's really just about identifying the work that women are already doing and resourcing both the work itself and then protection measures to guard against the security risk. The rights defenders in particular face immense risk and have very few alternatives in terms of where to turn to seek protection when their lives come under threat as a result of the human rights and women's rights work that they've been doing in the field. The international community, the United States in particular, has done quite a bit of work to try to resource support for women's political participation. It's of course never quite enough, and there's still quite a lot of work to be done, and we hope that once the April 2014 elections conclude, we don't forget that in fact the parliamentary elections in 2015 are just around the corner. Where we continue to fall short, though, is thinking about women in the security sector. We've been really slow to evolve our perspectives of how women engage as security actors. You know, it took us the better part of a decade to realize that Afghan women are not just victims, that they're also, in fact, political actors. And now we're coming around to the fact that, you know, they also need to play a meaningful and substantial role in the security sector as well. And of course, when we're talking about the security sector, I'm not just exclusively talking about the security forces. I'm also talking about the judicial system, the penal system, and then women in policy-setting institutions. So you're thinking about your Ministry of Interior, your Ministry of Defense, and then the defense committees in each house of Parliament. You're thinking about women defining what security is, defining what national security priorities are, and then devising the ways in which the country seeks to achieve those strategies, right? What it chooses to prioritize and deprioritize in that. In Afghanistan right now, you do have women in the Afghan National Security Forces. They're about 1% of the police force and 0.3% of the military. These numbers are low, but the number of women in both of these, in both the police and army, has increased quite dramatically over the last 4 years, in particular when more attention has been paid to a dedicated recruitment and retention effort. This was framed, the idea of women in the security forces was framed early on as a women's rights issue. So the idea was women have a right to serve in the army, and we have a right to serve in the military and police, and there should be equal opportunity for them to do so. We've come around to realize, as time has gone on, that, and when I say we, I'm not talking about inclusive security per se, but I'm talking about sort of the entirety of the intervention in Afghanistan, the way that we've supported it, to realize that this is really not just about a women's rights issue, though of course they do have a right to be there. It's also about, achieving our broader political, security, and economic objectives in Afghanistan, right? Without women in the Afghan National Security Forces, you can't think about democracy promotion, counterterrorism, or the effort to provide security to Afghan communities in a robust, meaningful, and comprehensive way. Okay, so I'll go through each of those points to make more clear what I mean by that. In the realm of democracy promotion, without female security personnel to support the elections, Afghan women will literally not be allowed to vote. The majority of voter registration and polling stations are sex segregated in Afghanistan, and voters are subject to a body search before entering. Female security officers are required to staff the women-only stations, and in the absence of sufficient number of female security personnel, women-only voter registration and polling stations remain closed. To say that again, the polling stations will literally close if there are not enough female security personnel to staff them. It's been projected that we need 13,000 female security personnel across the country to staff the April 5th election. Right? At present, I'm not sure of the exact number, but the effort to recruit and contract those women, the idea was to put them all on temporary contracts since there's not enough time to run them through the basic training programs for the Afghan National Police and Army. That effort didn't really roll out until December, January of this year because it was projected to cost about $25 to $30 million, and the NATO training mission wasn't willing to ante up the funds, so they tried to secure the funds externally from another donor state, and it took them quite a while to do that. So needless to say that trying to recruit 13,000 female security personnel in the span of 4 months was no easy feat. Securing an election is, of course, not limited to policing the polling stations. Provincial and regional security plans are also required to minimize threats posed by the insurgency, and so the question is, of course, whether or not an all-male force can deter the threat. And the answer to that is, of course, no. Last year in Afghanistan, on at least 13 recorded occasions, male insurgents dressed as women entered restricted areas from which they launched attacks. So there were no female body searches to stop them. They entered restricted areas. They usually enter buildings that are under construction, but they launched major coordinated attacks, including the massive coordinated attack on the U.S. Embassy that happened last year. Units that include women provide for greater search capabilities, but also generally increase the operational effectiveness of the force by expanding the female engagement capabilities of that force. So when, let's say, the Army goes into an Afghan community to assist with disaster response and relief, as the Afghan National Army is often tasked to do, when you have female soldiers on board, they have the capacity to conduct needs assessments with women members of those communities, and then to better assist in gender-sensitive distribution of assistance, right, which you can't have with an all-male unit. Beyond the elections and securing the country against the insurgency, there's the core obligation to provide law and order at a local level, which is part and parcel of our mission objectives in country, and of course, the core obligation of the Afghan government. You can consider just one component of that being sexual and gender-based violence, right, in the way that affects local communities in Afghanistan. Sexual and gender-based violence in Afghanistan is endemic, with as many as 87% of women experiencing some form of domestic abuse or forced marriage in their lifetime. We've seen an increase, unfortunately, in the reported incidences of violence against women. We've seen an increase of about 25%, just looking at March through September of 2013, and that's in comparison to the same time period in 2012. Those numbers have been reported by the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission. With female police officers in place, these crimes are more likely to be properly registered, investigated, and prosecuted, whereas with male officers in place, women either get turned away, blamed for the crime, or worse, suffer repeat abuse at the hand of the male officer. So I focus primarily there on women in the Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police, but of course, as I mentioned in the start, the security sector is not limited to the security forces. The women, we're also talking about women as judges and prosecutors. We're talking about women managing prisons. We're talking about women in security and setting security policy, defining what these national security priorities are. And right now, women comprise less than 10% of judges, just about 6% of prosecutors. There's still no woman on the Supreme Court, despite the fact that there's a seat reserved for one, it just remains empty. And there's a woman who heads the Defense Committee in Parliament, in the lower house of Parliament, but that committee is still largely defunct. And the Parliament has been slow to come around to this idea of, more generally, a civilian oversight of security forces, so hasn't really been able to execute the oversight over security policy that it should. But the reality is that if you want to ensure equality under the law for men and women, you have to ensure legal recourse is available to women. In a country that's as sex segregated as Afghanistan is, you have to be thinking about how to get women into these positions, those that preside over the execution of justice most specifically. So that's the general gist of it, right? So the international community right now is looking at the security transition. We're looking at the political transition. Everything that we do from here out hinges on the success of both of those. And that's without the, of course, incredible variable of whether or not the Afghan government, or Karzai in particular, signs onto the bilateral security agreement. Right now, of course, we're looking at commitments for sustained support and trying to shape what that looks like, right? Because we haven't really gotten foreign assistance right in Afghanistan. So a lot of this is not just about committing dollars for post-2014 era, but it's about rethinking how to use those dollars, how to get them to women's NGOs directly in country instead of going through large U.S. government contractors. It's thinking about longer-term sustainable development, not just quick impact programs that need to be implemented in the span of 4 to 6 months, as has often been the case. It's about continuing to support, nurture this this new rise in civic engagement. This really is a new thing that's come around with this election. So you want to nurture that, you want to build it, and you want to make sure that the expectations that it raises are not lost, you know, that hope isn't dashed and that people lose faith in the democratic process as a result. Of course, we'll be looking to ensure that as the U.S. forces transition to primarily a support role where they're meant to look at the professionalization of the Afghan National Security Forces, that they're understanding that part and parcel of that is constructing and standing up a representative and inclusive force, which means that you have a significant, meaningful role for women both in the Army and police. And that we're, you know, at this point really contingency planning. So there's a need to step back and devise innovative protection strategies in the event that things do fall apart to some extent, for lack of a better term. You know, women have done incredible things at a community level in particular underneath the Taliban and then throughout over the last 12 years to figure out ways at a local national level to protect themselves through various networks and associations. And then the question now is how do we support that planning and resource whatever it is that they devise and come up with. Beyond what the international community can do, there's a lot of work that the Afghan women's movement needs to undertake as well, and they've started in on that thinking. There are a number of prominent Afghan women's rights activists who have come together over the past few months to start mapping out what's worked in their movement, where they've really had success in forcing systemic change, where things have fallen apart a bit, and what needs to happen to strengthen and sustain the movement in the wake of the intervention in the post-2014 era. So with that, Tanya, why don't I hand it back over to you?
Before we hear from Tanya, just one quick housekeeping thing. First of all, thank you, Michelle. That was really, really informative. I just want to remind everyone how to ask questions. Please type them using the question box on your panel, and then I will read them out loud to Michelle. Tanya?
Thank you so much for that, Michelle. I think it was a tremendous amount of information that we'll all be needing to digest, and I'm sure that we have a number of questions out there. So while those questions are coming in, I just want to highlight, actions that we can take, right? I think Kathy Robinson, our Senior Public Policy Director, always says that A in WAND is for action, right? So what can we do? And you've probably been hearing us talk a lot about the Women, Peace, and Security Act, that's Senate Bill 1942 and House Bill 2874. And this legislation was reintroduced in the U.S. Congress for the sole purpose to promote women's meaningful inclusion and participation in peace and security processes in order to prevent, mitigate, or resolve violent conflict. And this bill will enable Congress to exercise oversight over the implementation of the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security that was enacted in December 2011 by executive order. And the reason the WPS Act is so important is because it mandates that the U.S., in all of its diplomatic, defense, and development-related work, integrates women and gender perspectives in their processes and policies. And so in regards to how we're engaging with Afghanistan through the political transition process and the security transition process, that we have a responsibility as a country to ensure that women are at the table at every stage of these processes. So you'll receive a follow-up email from WAND after this, this webinar. And this will give you an opportunity to take action on our Women, Peace, and Security Act. And on that, I'm just going to open it up for questions because I'm sure there's just a number of you wanting to hear more from Michelle. Thank you.
Yes, we definitely do have a number of questions. Our first question is from Reza Akbari. Reza asks, can you please elaborate a little more about the response of the Afghan government to the suggested reforms? How wide is the resistance from conservative factions?
To the suggested reforms, particularly, sorry, is she talking specifically about within the security forces or more broadly than that?
I think more broadly than that.
Okay. Well, so there's not a single response that you get back from the Afghan government. It's quite varied. It's quite inconsistent. Even from the same actor, one day you'll get a positive response and the next a less positive response. I would say our organization has been working with the Afghan government on, they're currently developing a national action plan on women, peace, and security. So in that process, there's a 16-member drafting committee. There are 14 ministries on that committee and then 2 semi-government agencies. And I've been fairly surprised by the openness, not only at the working level, but at the deputy minister level. So those folks are engaged in drafting the plan as well, in thinking through this in terms of how women assist in achieving broader state-building objectives, right? So coming at it not just about from a women's rights perspective, but thinking about, well, how can we truly think about building a representative and participatory democracy if we're not thinking about engaging women? And how can we think about a security force that addresses the needs of all Afghans if there aren't women on the force? And that argument is quite easy in a country like Afghanistan where everything is so sex segregated, right? You have separate gathering space for women, you have separate schools for women. Even for the police and army, there's separate female training battalions. So it's actually quite easy to make an argument about why you need women in decision-making positions and policy-making positions, women as security actors, to tend to the needs of women in community and women nationwide, right? So there's been quite a bit of progress. There are a number of internal working groups in the ministries dedicated exclusively to women, peace, and security. There are not only women on those working groups, there are men and women working together on this, trying to think creatively about what this looks like. So that's the rosy picture. I'll be honest, of course, it's not true everywhere, particularly when we come to Parliament. It's a much more hostile environment when we're trying to advance legal protections or at least maintain legal protections for women. And so that's where the gains I see are much more tenuous. And then, of course, at a provincial level, far more challenging when you're looking at provincial councils and what's happening there in terms of protections for women's rights. So all I can say is that there's not an across-the-board response, but there are a number of strong allies within key ministries that before helping to develop the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, didn't necessarily realize were there. And I've been emboldened by it. It gives me quite a bit of hope.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Our next question is from Elaine Noneman. Elaine asks, what are the strongest points we need to make in lobbying for appropriation of NDAA funds authorized for women's participation in the Afghan security sector?
Okay, great. Elaine, thanks for your question. Nice to hear from you. Let me go. I skipped over this slide because I felt like I was running over in my remarks, but I just popped back to a slide on U.S. legislative action. So Elaine is referencing our National Defense Authorization Bill, which has contained for the last 2 years language about Afghan women's security. So last year there was broader strokes, with language that just said, in planning for the security transition, U.S. forces must account for the impact of that transition on Afghan women's security and, respond accordingly, right? So must integrate measures in their interventions, in their transition planning that try to mitigate the risk or the threat or the impact on Afghan women's security. This year, the language became more specific and was more focused on recruitment and retention of women in the Afghan National Security Forces, as well as securing female personnel for the elections, right? So contracting those 13,000 women, female security personnel to staff the polling stations in April. And then, of course, there's a 1230 report, which if you're interested in referencing back to how U.S. forces have reported on that effort, you can reference the 1230 report. They come out every 6 months, and they're publicly available. The Defense Authorization Act this year authorized $25 million specifically for what I just outlined, recruitment and retention of women in the Afghan National Security Forces. The appropriations bill had the same language. So this is the first time in the 10 years since this particular account has existed within our appropriations bill that money has been explicitly reserved for recruitment and retention of women. In fact, it's the first time the word women was ever present in the authorizing and appropriating language for the appropriations language for the Afghan Security Forces Fund, which is the fund that essentially pays almost in full for the Afghan National Security Forces. Typically, it's between $7 and $11 billion. This year, it was a $4.7 billion appropriation, and of that, $25 million was reserved specifically for women. Right now, Elaine, to your question about the fiscal year 2015 National Defense Authorization Act, because negotiations are already in place for that. They're already taking place. Language is already being drafted. We're in a little bit of a tight spot because we don't yet have information about how the $25 million was or will be used, right? So we can't yet demonstrate impact of the money. We can't say, you reserved for the first time $25 million, which is great, and now you were able to do all these amazing things, and next year you should do the same, which is going to make this a little bit of a harder fight this time around, particularly as everybody is trying to pull in the purse strings. That said, of course, we're going to do everything we can to try to retain the language. So I think, beyond just recruitment and retention of women in the Afghan National Security Forces, we'll try to include broader language as well around general support for protection measures designed by Afghan women to ensure not only national level legal protections, but also, of course, local level security protection. So we'll look for broader sweeping language around mitigating the negative impact on Afghan women's security and look to retain the language on women in the Afghan National Security Forces in particular. It's just a question now of the monetary figure that we're going to be pushing. I imagine we'll just stick with the $25 million since it seemed to work last year and it's easiest to get Congress just to do what they already did once. But still, it'll be a question mark, and it'll be a bit of a push on the Hill for that reason.
Thank you. Our next question is from Erin Leach. Erin asks, what resources are being dedicated specifically to rural women in southern provinces like Helmand and Kandahar, since they experienced reduced mobility and higher levels of insecurity, but seem to have fewer polling stations at which to vote?
Yeah, women in the South are probably the most isolated in terms of access to foreign assistance, which is a huge concern. There's not really an easy answer to that question. USAID has, I don't know if folks on the phone are aware of the PROMOTE initiative. That's an acronym for something I don't know what PROMOTE stands for, but it's a commitment of $250 million over the next 5 years explicitly for Afghan women's development. That money is meant to target women in rural areas specifically and is meant to be distributed equally amongst the various regions of Afghanistan. So there should be quite a bit of money still going to isolated southern provinces. So the question is, who's going to implement and oversee use of that money? Most of the women's NGOs in the South don't have the capacity to take on U.S. funding directly, so there needs to be some sort of intermediary. Intermediaries have typically relied on the U.S. military or the international military presence for their security infrastructure in those provinces. So they've either been embedded on provincial reconstruction teams, which are sort of these like hybrid civ-mil entities in the provincial centers, or embedded with military folks directly, which has its own set of issues and problems. But that's really where these donor intermediaries ensured their protection and security, and a lot of that infrastructure is now gone. So I think this is still a question mark that for all of us, U.S. government and NGOs included, as to, okay, well, what's that link going to be? Because we know that the money's not going to go out without any monitoring and oversight capability. So how do we at least create space for some monitoring and oversight, enough that would be palatable to the U.S. government so that the money is still pushed out in the way that it was intended? So I don't have a good answer for you, but that's what I know.
So we have another question concerning the PROMOTE program from Marla Gitterman. Marla asks, what do you think are realistic examples of concrete successes as a result of the PROMOTE program and its long-term commitment to Afghan women?
So we have no concrete examples as of yet because the money has not yet been pushed out. So that's an easy question to answer. But I think, you know, there is quite a lot. I mean, it's just unfortunate the picture that we get through the media about the current state of affairs in Afghanistan, because, you know, I've been in and out of Afghanistan for about 6 years now. It is nothing like it was 6 years ago. The women of Afghanistan today are not the women of yesterday. They're not the women of 2001. It's incredible the amount of not only social and economic development that's happened, but also political development in terms of mobilization of movements and the development of civil society organizations. There have been a number of development interventions that I think have been quite successful. So one was orchestrated by an organization. It was USAID money, but orchestrated through Counterpart International, which was an effort to build up the institutional capacity of local NGOs. And so they had this kind of hierarchy, or this network where they would focus on training one fairly strong NGO, Afghan NGO, in a provincial center or regional center. They would spend a lot of time, I think it was about a year or two that they would spend building up the internal systems and capacity of that organization, and then set that organization up to train other smaller organizations in the province. So it was like this trickle-down effect that seemed to work fairly well. It didn't work everywhere, but in the West and North in particular, it worked very, very well. And the organizations are stronger and all the better for it. I also seen interesting programs that are supporting women's integration in the civil service and women in the Afghan administration. So those programs have been focused on not just training and educational development, but then follow-on internships. So the real issue has always been, okay, we love to fund training, right? So we fund so much training. We train 25,000 women how to, you know, do some kind of income-generating activity, but then the market doesn't create space for jobs for those women. So you train them in some sort of economic activity, or you train them in some skill, and there's nowhere for them to go. There's nowhere for them to seek active employment. And that has been really problematic in terms of deflating expectations and hindering our ability to see real and meaningful impacts from some of the assistance that we've pushed out. But there have been interesting programs with it, trying to, like, where they've done training for women on, you know, engaging with the civil service, and then they set up internships for them in the ministries, and through that they gain professional experience, contacts, and networks, and a lot of women have expanded space for themselves within the government through that means. So I consider that a success, though it was a small one, of course.
Next question is from Alice Dahl. Alice asks, have female candidates in the current campaigns been allowed to make public appearances and show their faces on posters and campaign materials?
They have been allowed to. though the space for it has been quite limited, particularly in the South and Southeast. So yes, they've been allowed to do it, but the threats have continued. The space to campaign in the South and Southeast has been almost non-existent, and so it's really challenging. Part of the issue is that there's just really not the security support for women candidates in the same way that there is for men candidates. So a man who's, let's say, a prominent, what's the diplomatic term, power broker or warlord essentially, can go and either has his own cadre of armed men who can follow him around, or he can go to the government, to the National Directorate of Security, and get an armed detail to follow him around. It is much more difficult for female candidates to do that. Often they're denied it if they can even get audience with the kind of individual who would have the power to give them that sort of armed detail, so it doesn't happen. There's also not the concerted effort to create safe space for women to campaign, so that would be incumbent upon the Afghan government for the most part, but the United Nations can also do it. There are also other international entities that can do it in terms of creating safe, guarded space for women to campaign. Probably would need to be a women-only space in most areas in Afghanistan, but we really have never budgeted the money for a truly gender-sensitive political participation intervention in that way, right? So often we think, well, there's equal opportunity for men and women to campaign. The women don't because of X, Y, and Z social and cultural barriers. Oh, well. And we haven't done a lot to accommodate or try to get around some of those barriers directly.
Thank you.
Sure.
Our next question is from Catherine Powell. Catherine asks, with women's rights gains at the local level through village-level initiatives supported by the World Bank, the U.S., etc., how can the international community continue to support such efforts after the drawdown?
Yeah, so that's great. Actually, it's great that you reference I assume you're talking about the National Solidarity Program in particular, the NSP, which was this probably arguably the most successful development intervention in Afghanistan. And so what that did was an international trust fund. It was managed by the World Bank, and it said, okay, let's empower and support political agency at the village level. So the Constitution sets up that there should be like municipal level elections. It never happens. We tried national, that was hard enough. We got to provincial, that was really hard. So we just really didn't want to do elections at any lower level, at a district or a village level. So what the National Solidarity Program did was it said, okay, we're not going to elect councils, but let's go ahead and try to find some consensus-based mode of appointing councils. And these councils will not serve political purposes, but instead will be exclusively focused on community development. So they call them often community development councils or NSP shuras, or they have different names everywhere depending upon how the translation went. And so they have these community development councils, hundreds of them, maybe even thousands actually now across the country. And the NSP had these grant streams set up so that once the council was established through consensus, and there were requirements for women's representation on the council, and if it was not acceptable for women to be on the same council as men, they created separate councils, which I thought was great. So you'd have a separate female council and separate male council if it was not acceptable, let's say in a very conservative southern province, to have women and men serving on the same body. And then what they had to do, the council was responsible for a needs assessment at a village level, and then they would put together proposals. The proposals would go to a district level development committee, then a provincial development committee, then to the national level, and they would get funded, right? And so it was a way to ensure agency at a community level, and not only defining their need, but defining the solutions to address those needs, and it was hugely successful. Now, support for those councils has fallen off in recent years, even prior to the drawdown, even prior to 2014. So I think you bring up a good point in reminding us that those things exist. I think a lot of people probably now dealing with Afghanistan have forgotten that ever even happened. And this is a lot of the problem with the massive turnover in the intervention, right? And so I think it's good to remember that there was so much effort to stand up these institutions at a very local level. And so we already have these channels for the distribution of resources for social and economic development, right? So I think maybe sort of the longest roundabout way to answer your question, I'm not sure if I even will in the end, but is to say that, you know, those committees are set up, those structures and processes were set up. It was painful to set up those processes. Finding a way to transparently distribute money from the national to local level while minimizing corruption is a painful, painful thing in Afghanistan. We've already gone through the trouble. So I would say your best bet moving forward is really to try to leverage that work that's already been done and try to continue to sustain those institutions that already exist instead of trying to recreate the wheel, come up with something new, or circumventing provincial and district level entities to go straight to the local level in the future.
Thank you. All right, our next question is from Samin Wadat, and Samin asks, what kind of impact does the uncertainty about the future of Afghanistan have on Afghan women's safety and security beyond 2014?
You know, Samin, I struggle with this all the time. I think, you know, and Samin, we should know, has done a lot of, Samin is a very prominent activist and has done a lot of work to address the need to sustain support for Afghan women, particularly from the international community, post-2014. There's not an easy answer. The uncertainty, particularly around the bilateral security agreement and not being sure about what sustained support and commitment looks like, induces quite a bit of fear. And what we're honestly seeing already is that a lot of activists, particularly female activists, are leaving the country, and you can't blame them, right? They're not sure what's going to happen post-2014. They're not sure what's going to happen with the peace negotiations, with the elections, et cetera. So a lot of them are seeking higher education or asylum, et cetera, elsewhere. Of course, the brain drain for the women's movement is a huge concern, and it's going to be something that, let's be honest, would be difficult to recover from. So I think, you know, you see Afghan women right now to some extent hedging their bets. I see women, it's hard to like make a generalization because at the national level there's things happening that have never happened before. Like major national conferences of women, like there was just a convening of 200 women in Kabul where 7 of the presidential candidates came and sat in at the convening, and women literally grilled them for 2 days straight about their political platform. That has never happened before, and it's incredible. Those 200 women came from the provinces. They weren't all elite middle-class women from Kabul. They were women from the north, west, south, east, coming in to engage in that kind of civic democratic debate. So that's incredible. At the same time, at a provincial level, you see women pulling back out of necessity. The security protections aren't there. Women who access international support, particularly, you know, from the U.S. and other Western nations, and then the U.S. and other Western nations have left, it leaves those women very vulnerable. And so, you know, they have to draw back to some extent a little bit until that dies down, until the threat of the fact that they engaged with internationals, until people forget, so they can resume their activities. We, of course, see increasing threats on female teachers. There are increasing threats against girls' schools. So women are losing access to public space at a local level. And there's not really, there aren't enough assurances in place right now for women all across the country to take the huge risk that it does take to do some of the women's rights advocacy at a local level. But that said, it's not all being drawn back. There's so much happening still across the country, and especially at a national level, that's unprecedented. And the women who are on the provincial peace committees are doing, I mean, just incredibly courageous, life-threatening work. They're negotiating directly with commanders. They're settling intertribal and interclan disputes as a component of the reintegration effort. They're staging hunger strikes when fighters are refusing to reintegrate their brigades. So I can't say that there's a single generalization. I do think that without the assurances, particularly without the bilateral security agreement being signed, women are being careful. Drawing back.
All right, I think we have time for just 1 or 2 more questions. We're going to take a question from Melissa Charbonneau. Melissa asks, are Afghan law schools focusing any attention on women's legal protection in their training?
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. They are. It's not across the board. Usually it's a special program. There are a lot of targeted programs which, to be honest, haven't necessarily come from the universities themselves. They've come from international NGOs working with universities to set up special programs on like women's rights under Islamic law, for instance. And there was an initiative by the Ministry of Interior at one point to try to recruit women coming out of the Sharia law faculty who had gone through also special training about women's rights and protections for women's security and safety under Islamic law. And we're trying to recruit them into the Afghan National Police's family response units, which are these entities they set up at a district and provincial level to respond explicitly to sexual and gender-based violence. So the idea was, okay, you're going to train up these lawyers. Let's be honest, they're mostly women, but you're going to train up these women lawyers at in these universities and then send them out to be embedded in these police units that were set up specifically to address survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. So yes, it is happening. It's piecemeal. It's siloed. It's not necessarily integrated and mainstreamed in the curriculum, but it's there.
All right. Our last question today is going to be from Sheila Scanlon. Sheila asks, how do we get more interest from our top leaders on both sides to take an interest in Afghan women's issues?
Sheila Scanlon. So Sheila Scanlon has done more for Afghan women in the last 2 years than most officials engaged in the international intervention in Kabul. She's an incredible activist for these things. How do you get leaders to take interest? You know, if I had the magic answer to that question, we'd be better off right now. I would say, though, let's be fair, there is a lot of interest here, right? Particularly amongst Congress, where a lot of the justification for a continued U.S. presence in Afghanistan, there was a lot of that was based on the need to support Afghan women, to support and strengthen Afghan women. And they feel a need and obligation to deliver to their constituencies on the promises that were made. It wasn't just rhetoric, right? But then you transfer over not just to the administration, but to the Department of Defense, where certainly there are a lot of people who are concerned about Afghan women's security. But with so much money coming through the Department of Defense, it's taken them a little bit, you know, they really need to exercise leadership on this, and it's taken them a little while to understand that Afghan women are a core component of stabilizing the country, that integrating women not only into the security forces, but into the planning for, you know, the security transition plans and security operations is a core component of their mandate. And that it's not just, women aren't just something that state and aid deal with, it's in fact part of devising a security strategy, a national security strategy for a nation, is thinking about their integration in that effort, their leadership in that effort. So that's been slower. So I think, you know, with the Department of Defense, often if you can't get folks on board to believe that something's important, you order them to think it's important and deliver, right? So we've been taking that approach. You try to the extent possible to get top-down directives issued, and I think, you know, we've seen some glimmers of hope, particularly like you can look at folks like Lieutenant General Caldwell, who exercised tremendous leadership on this agenda while in theater. And, you know, there have been some really strong allies on this, and it's about leveraging them to message to the other leaders who might be a little bit more hesitant right now.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. You have been a really wonderful resource to our audience. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us and to share all this great information with us. Just a couple of things before we end the webinar. One, I think a few of you had asked about the Women, Peace, and Security Act that's currently in the U.S. Congress right now. That's Senate Bill 1942 and House Bill 2874, and we encourage all of you to ask your senators and your members of Congress to support that legislation. Lastly, just want to remind everyone of our next upcoming webinar. It's going to be an overview of the federal budget. It's taking place next Wednesday, March 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and we encourage you to join us if you are available. Before you exit the webinar, please be sure to fill out the survey. We really welcome your feedback and hope to hear from you. And again, just want to say a big thank you to Michelle and to everyone for joining us on the webinar today. Thanks so much, and with that, we'll end.